What's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. I'm Bryce, and today I'm going to read chapter 26 of the Parker Inheritance. Let's begin. Chapter 26. The next day, Candace sat in the front passenger seat of Tori's red Honda Civic as it crept up Highway 176 toward Columbia. They had looked out. After Miss Kathy found Ellie's Farmer's number, they spoke to Mrs. Farmer on the phone, and she suggested they visit in person. Even better, Tori had the day off. It took a bit of coaxing and Brandon promising to wash her car, but she eventually agreed to drive them. Candace shifted the dashboard vent so the air conditioning wouldn't blow directly on her. She had offered to sit in the back, but Brandon claimed it for himself. Now he was slumped over his seat and opened a book cradle in his hands. He'd fallen asleep about 20 minutes ago. Should I wake him up? Candace asked, turning around to look at him. He's gonna hurt his neck. He'll be fine. You should see how he sleeps at night. Can't even count the number of times he's fallen out of bed. So anyway, when will you guys tell me what's really going on with all this research? It took Candace a moment to process what Tori was asking. She tried to make her face blank. I have no idea what you're talking about. I know Brandon's not working on a school project. She peeked at him in the rearview mirror. Either y'all are up to something or y'all are dating. Candace's skin was supernova. We're not dating. Somehow she yelled and hissed it at the same time. I'm kidding. Brandon doesn't even know what dating means. But if you're not dating, that means. Just as she felt with Brandon, Candace wanted to trust Tori. It would be good to talk to someone else. Someone older, but not an adult. Someone who might actually believe them instead of calling them kids. Someone who wouldn't say anything too bad about her grandmother. Don't laugh, okay? Candace readjusted the dashboard vent again. I think we think there's a fortune hidden somewhere in town. Tori didn't laugh, so Candace continued. She told her about the letter addressed to her grandmother and how they believe James Parker wrote it. She even told her about the secret tennis game and how the Washingtons had been forced to leave the city. Tori nodded with each revelation. What do you think? Candace finally asked. Are we crazy? You're imaginative, Tori replied. The navigation app on her phone directed her to turn onto the interstate. I'm guessing you haven't told your mom yet? Mom was pretty mad at Grandma over this mystery. I don't think she liked me picking up where she left off. You're probably right. Tori slowed as she passed a highway patrol car. Candace leaned over to peek at the speedometer. They were already going well below the posted limit. Anyway, at least it gives Brandon something to do, she continued. This has been a tough summer for him with Quincy gone. Quincy is his best friend. He's in Seattle with his grandparents. Milo's mom mentioned something about that. Yeah, I bet she did. Tori shook her head. Some people don't know when to mind their own business. Facts. Ain't that the truth? Yeah, I bet she did. Tori shook her head. Some people don't know when to mind their own business. Wait, I just read that. My bad. Some brain fart. Candace knew Tori was talking about Mrs. Stanford and not her, but she still took that as a sign to not ask any questions. I don't think you have to slow it down so much, she said, looking at the speedometer again. Sorry, she sped up a little bit. Just don't trust the police. I don't want to give them any reason to stop me. You know about all the black people getting killed or hurt by the cops, right? Even when they're unarmed? Candace nodded. She didn't follow the reports too much. Her dad didn't like her looking at violence, even if it was on the news. Still, there was no way to avoid hearing about it. It's not like I think all police officers are bad, Tori said, but I also have a lot less to worry about if I don't get pulled over. Plus, Mom would yank my driver's license if I got a ticket. The last thing I need. The phone spoke up again, cutting Tori off. She turned on her signal and moved to the right lane. Thanks again for agreeing to take us, Candace said. No problem. If not for this, I'm pretty sure Mom would have us doing something else to stay out of the house. She checked the dashboard clock. Any second now, the school district superintendent should be showing up there. Really? Yep, our moms talked to Mr. Rittenhauer and the principal yesterday about what happened to you and Brandon at the school. I guess They didn't like what they heard, so they called the superintendent. He thought it would be better to come to our house instead of our mom's making an appointment in the office. Probably wanted to avoid a paper trail. She laughed. Your mom is a real firecracker, by the way. I overheard her talking to my mom last night. She's very colorful when she's mad. I can't believe they're going through all this trouble because of us. It's not the first time Mr. Rittenhauer has mistreated black kids. Will he be fired? Probably not, but that doesn't mean our mom shouldn't speak up. She jerked her head behind her. We're almost there. Better wake up, Brandon. 20 minutes later, they turned into a Gated subdivision. It reminded Candace of her neighborhood in Atlanta. Every yard was perfectly manicured with lush green grass. They passed a large playground and pool, both filled with laughing kids. I think this is it, Tori said as she parked in front of a large two-story red brick house. A huge SUV sat in the driveway. It must have been new. It didn't even have a real license plate. Candace didn't notice the older man in the yard until he stood up from behind a hedge of red tips. His knees were covered with rich black dirt, and he wore a pair of green gardening gloves. Can I help you? He asked as they stepped out of the car. We're here to meet Ellie Farmer, Candace said. Oh, you're the kid she was talking about. He peeled off his gloves and hurried over to them. I'm her husband, Jane. Before they had finished shaking hands, a woman with a pink blouse and cappers opened her door. Her gray and black hair was pulled into a short ponytail. Daddy, what are you doing? The lawn guy will be here next week. What pay for something I can do for free? Facts. Are you at least wearing sunscreen? This skin ain't getting no darker. Cancer, Daddy? You've heard of it, right? I'm fine, Rosalie. Can you take these kids in to see Ellie? I'm coming right back with the sunscreen, she turned to Tori. I'm sorry for that, Mama inside. She's been looking forward to meeting you all. Rosalie led them through the house. Pictures lined the walls. Jean and Ellie Farmer had a big family. You have a beautiful home, Tori said. Thank you, but it's not mine. Mama and Daddy moved here a few years ago and insisted on getting a house large enough for all their great-grandkids to visit at the same time. Rosalie stepped into a large den. Mama, your guests are here. A small woman sat on a recliner, her stocking-covered feet up in the air. She clutched a soda can with another within arm's reach on a small end table. A cane lay on the floor beside her. Where'd all that soda come from? Rosalie asked. Did Daddy get it for you while I was upstairs? No, the woman replied. Walked into the kitchen and got it myself. Rosalie picked up the can from the table. Please have a seat, she said to the others. I'll bring cookies and lemonade, but none for you, Mama. Candace, Brandon, and Tori huddled together on the couch. Now that they were there, Candace wasn't sure how they were supposed to start. Ellie Farmer pushed the switch, lowering the footrest on her recliner. I've got diabetes, high blood pressure, a hyperactive thyroid, and poor circulation in my legs. And she's worried about a little caffeine. 2 cans is not a little, her daughter called from the kitchen. And it's the sugar I'm worried about, not the caffeine. That girl here's like a hawk, Ellie said, quieter. She scooted forward in her chair. What can I help you with? You had questions about Perkins High, she asked, looking at Tori. I'm the chauffeur. Tori thumbed at Brandon and Candace. The two are the junior detectives. These two are the junior detectives. We're interested in Siobhan Washington, Candace began. We were looking through yearbooks and saw that you and Siobhan were members of the same club. Did you know her well? A small smile came to Ellie's lips. That is a name I haven't heard for a very long time, she said. Yes, I knew Siobhan. She was one of my best friends. Candace felt Brandon sit up beside her. What was she like? He asked. Siobhan was one of the smartest girls I ever knew, though she never rubbed it in your face like other people. She loved puzzles, especially ones involving math. Now Candace sat up. She was a whiz with numbers, Mrs. Farmer continued. She could do math in her head, multiplying and dividing numbers that would take most people 5 minutes to figure out with pencil and paper. She got that from her daddy. What about tennis? Candace asked. Did she like that as much as her father? Oh, she loved it. She was a great player. Her daddy wanted her to be the next Althea Gibson. Of course, back when we didn't have a girls' tennis team, it was hard enough to have a boys' team, not enough colored schools around to play against. Rosalie returned carrying a tray of cookies and lemonade. She placed it on the coffee table, then lightly touched her mother's shoulder. "I'll be outside." Ellie nodded as Brandon picked up a cookie. "Can you tell us about the tennis game against the boys from Wallace?" he asked. She adjusted the blanket covering her thighs. "I wasn't there. Siobhan was, though. The way she explained it, our boys beat those other kids in tennis fair and square. Whooped them like they stole something, but it was just a game. Once it was over, that was supposed to be the end of it. But it wasn't?" Katori asked. She was leaning in, just like Brandon and Candace. Ellie Farmer shook her head. Word started to spread that night. How could it not? The Perkins boys had just beat the best tennis team in the state. The best white tennis team in the state. Most of us couldn't care less about tennis, but that didn't matter. Our boys won. That meant something. Facts. Candace was reminded of how Mr. Gibbs and Miss Kathy talked about black high schools. Ellie Farmer sounded just as proud. Anyway, Marion Allen didn't like that a whole bunch of us knew about the game. He gathered up with some of his buddies and attacked Coach Dub. Beat him in one of his players up real bad. Coach was never the same after that. But neither was Marion Allen. He lost his left eye that night. Her hand shook as she clutched her blanket. What's worse, the cowards didn't just threaten Coach Dub and the boys. They threatened, her voice caught. They threatened to do horrible things to Siobhan. Candace had to turn away. She couldn't take the look on Mrs. Farmer's face. It was like she was pained and sad and furious all at the same time. Of course, the police didn't do anything about it. We didn't even consider arresting Marion. If anything, they would have found a way to arrest Coach Dub, she sighed. Siobhan and her family moved to Maryland. She came back a handful of times to visit, but never stayed too long. Think it brought up too many bad memories. What happened to Mr. Washington? Brandon asked. He passed away a few years after they left Lambert, Mrs. Farmer said. They built and dedicated the tennis courts at Vickers Park to him. He's buried in Maryland with... Wait. Candace lurched forward. I'm sorry. Those tennis courts, they were dedicated to Coach Washington. Ellie nodded. Sure were. I was there for the ceremony. Do you know when they were built? Candace continued. 2006 or 2007? Long before that, Ellie said. It was back in the 80s. Siobhan was still alive. Came to the dedication and everything. Did they reconstruct them or something like that? A few years later, Candace asked. Maybe with a private donation? The older woman shook her head. Those tennis courts were perfectly fine until that crazy fool from the city went and had them dug up. I mean, come on, what was she thinking? Candace's stomach twisted into a knot as Ellie railed on her grandmother. Candace balled her fists up and then shoved them underneath her thighs as much as she wanted to argue. Candace could tell it was do no good. Ellie Farmer had long ago made up her mind, and there was nothing Candace could say to make her reconsider. She had to show her. Going back to Siobhan, Brandon said softly, did she ever date anyone when she was in high school or even after she left town? Ellie picked up a cookie. She was married once, but very briefly. Otherwise, she never mentioned anyone serious. She never dated anyone in high school either. Of course, Coach Dub would have killed her and the boy if she had. No one was good enough for his little Dub. Candace wiped her hands on her jeans. Mrs. Farmer, have you ever heard of James Parker? Ellie Farmer tilted her head and blinked a few times. Can't say that I have. Why do you ask? We think he knew Siobhan, Candace went on. He donated a bunch of money to create a memorial room at Perkins. He spent most of his life in Colorado, but we thought maybe he grew up in Lambert. I know almost everyone who graduated from Perkins while I was there, she said. Sure you got the name right? Candace shrugged. To be honest, she wasn't sure about anything. Well, I wish I could be more help with that, she said. Anything else you want to know about Siobhan? Candace and Brandon looked at each other. I think that's it, she said. Can we call you if we have more questions? Sure thing, she said. Now I have a question for you. Did you bring any of those yearbooks? We brought one, Brandon said. It's in the car, I'll get it. The door chimed as Brandon exited the house. Rosalie was with him when he returned. It's about time for your medicine, Rosalie said to her mother. and then you need to lie down. I'm fine, she said, but Mrs. Farmer had begun to slump in her seat and had yawned more and more as the conversation went on. Where's that yearbook? It's from your senior year, Brandon said, handing it to her. She held the yearbook like it was fragile glass. Want to see her mother when she was young and sexy? She asked her daughter. Mama, but Rosalie sat down on the armrest and watched as her mother opened the yearbook. Mrs. Farmer murmured to herself as she flipped through each page, pausing every once in a while to talk about someone from long ago. Candace couldn't tell if she was talking to her daughter or to herself, or maybe she was talking to the people in the pictures. Mrs. Farmer stopped on the page with Siobhan and ran her fingers across the photograph. She was so kind and generous, she said. I wouldn't have graduated without her. And if I had graduated, I would have never gotten that job at the telephone company, and I would have never met Jane. And Ellie's eyes were wet as she looked up at her daughter. You have no idea how much we owe her. Rosalie leaned over and kissed her mother on the forehead. Her eyes were wet too. Well, I really appreciate this, Mrs. Farmer said once she finished paging through the yearbook. She closed it and held it out to Candace. It's nice to go back and... Where did you get that? Where did you get that? Candace froze, her arms stretched forward, reaching for the yearbook. Ma'am? The bracelet. Ellie put the yearbook down in her lap, then grabbed Candace's arm, almost causing her to fall over. Rosalie placed her hand on the mother's back. Mama, you should calm down. The bracelet, she repeated, cutting her daughter off. Where did you get it? It's my grandma's, Candace said after a moment. She didn't want to admit who her grandmother really was, especially with the way Mrs. Farmer had talked about her. That used to belong to Siobhan. I recognize it anywhere. Mrs. Farmer traced a dark, wrinkled finger across the letters, stamped into the aluminum. See, right here, SW for Siobhan Washington. Candace's eyes widened. She had always thought the letters were MS for Mississippi. She'd been sure of it. Rosalie pried her mother's hand away from Candace. It's getting late, she said. Perhaps y'all should leave. Mrs. Farmer, do you know if Siobhan had anything engraved on the inside of her bracelet? Candace asked, rubbing her wrist. The woman pursed her lips together, then shook her head. No, I never saw the inside, but I'm sure it's hers. Ellie Farmer frowned. Or who knows, my memory isn't what it used to be. She picked up the yearbook and handed it to Candace. When you get home, you be sure to ask your grandma where she got that from. Candace took the yearbook. Sure thing. Okay, what just happened back there? Brandon asked as soon as they reached the car. Is that really Siobhan's bracelet? I don't know, Candace said. Grandma never mentioned it as it used to belong to someone else, but then Grandma didn't talk about a lot of things. And what was that about? Another engraving, he asked. The word love is stamped on the inside. She slipped the bracelet off her wrist and inspected it. All this time I thought the letters were MS for Mississippi, where my grandmother was born. She knocked her fist against her forehead. I'm such an idiot. I didn't realize I was looking at it upside down. Tough. But how could your grandmother have Siobhan's bracelet? Tori asked as they put away from the house. They've never met, right? No, I don't think so. The aluminum was cool in Candace's hands, but who knows? Brandon didn't speak for a long time. Finally, once they reached the interstate, he said, You said your grandmother didn't find anything underneath the tennis courts, right? But what if it's not true? You think she found the bracelet there? Tori asked. It's the only way, he replied. What do you think, Candace? But Candace was too busy staring at the bracelet to answer. If Brandon was right, if her grandmother had found the bracelet there, then her grandmother might not have been off track. Maybe she was supposed to dig up those courts. Maybe this was another clue. Maybe she hadn't made a mistake after all. And that was chapter 26. So tomorrow I'll be reading chapter 27. And that's about it. Peace out.